All right, so in this lesson, we're going to dive into keys and pads and getting those things dialed in our mix. Now, I find these to be kind of the last two things that we need to take care of because keys are, while they're very foundational, especially in the fact that they're playing both the rhythm and the chord progressions of things, it also is kind of one of those things that's kind of easy to fit into things. And a lot of the worship that we're going to be mixing today, especially in this context of this worship team, we're probably going to use it more as something that's just going to only poke out during the beginnings of songs and maybe if it's a solo kind of song where it's more of a down moment, but the rest of the time it's going to kind of sit more tucked back in things. So let's listen to this keyboard first, and then we'll kind of decide what we're going to do with it. So let's take a listen. All right, so already it sounds fantastic. I mean, this is a great sounding keyboard to start with, so we don't have to do a whole lot to it. The only things that we're really going to do are just things to just help it in the context of our mix and our PA system. So the first thing we're going to do is high pass. Now, while I love the sound of this keyboard and how rich it is and how much low end there is in it, it's a little bit too much just because I know that in my system, my low end tends to get easily muddied up if I have too many things sending the same notes and frequencies to it. So I'm going to actually high pass filter it, in this case about 150 hertz, and we're just going to take a listen to it and see how it sounds now compared to what it sounded before. So this is what it sounds like now with that high pass filter. And you see there's that little spike there, about 100 hertz-ish, which is just that last low note. And while I love how full that is, I know that it needs to feel more like this just because on my PA system, I need a little bit less of that low end in there. I'm going to actually pull it back just a touch, let a little bit more back in, because I know the bass is going to also help out too. Okay, what else can we do here? I think there's a little bit of some resonance, some string resonance happening about 250 maybe. Listen again here. Just a touch. I'm just going to duck this little section here out. Just to carve out and clean it up. I also know that my system here likes to have a lot of that build up there, so I'm just going to do that just because I know it would make sense in my room. All right, so let's talk about compression on keys real fast. Now, in this instance, the keyboard player I was working with happened to have a really great sounding rig. They use a laptop and run all their sounds through it, and they've got plugins galore, making this thing sound as great as it can. So in this case, my compressor is going to be more for just adding some contextual compression to it in the midst of everything else happening in the mix, as well as kind of utility just to kind of glue it together with the rest of the sound I'm going for. Now, I am going to be using 1176 in this case because, again, it's one of the best compressors I have on this board. That sounds great with it. And we're using this to really just kind of help tame some of the attack in the context of the mix. So let's take a listen to it before and after, and then we'll talk about what's happening. All right, so as you can hear, what's happening is that we're taking a little bit of the initial bite of the attack off every time they slam down those keys. Just enough that like you feel it, but then it kind of tucks back just a little bit of the aggressiveness of it, if you will. And we're doing that with an 8-to-1 ratio. We've got the attack almost about noon and the release set pretty slow, so that way it kind of naturally lets that compression go along with the sustain of the compressor. Excuse me, of the note of the keyboard. So that said, let's listen again, and we're just going to mess with the attack and release times just to kind of hear what else we could do with this if we wanted to. So let's start by cranking the attack. And that sounds okay versus this. That seems a little more natural, so I'm going to just go back to that noon setting where we're letting it hear the initial punch, but it just sits back just ever so much right afterwards. So you feel it, but then it sits back, which is what I'm going for here. We'll listen to the release a little bit faster here. And see, I'm finding that that's letting the low end bring up too much like right away. I want it to sit back a little bit. I want you to feel that initial hit up front, and then it slowly brings back the sound, but while lifting that low end up, if that makes sense. So let's just listen again one more time. Kick it off. We're just kind of taming the dynamics of it. That's all we're doing. Okay, let's move on to the pads now. Now the pads in this case, we're not going to do a whole lot. We're just going to listen to them first, and then we'll kind of decide if there's any utility things we need to do to it. Because the pads, I know, already sound great. In fact, let's take a listen. Awesome sounding pad. It's got some nice warmth to it. It's very analog sounding. Some bright fizziness on the top. So let's just go and dive right in here. So we'll go ahead and kick in a high pass because I don't need all of that low end. This is the same, what's being played here is whatever is happening on the piano. So it's a duplication of it. And I know I definitely don't need all the low end left-hand stuff that's happening here because I've got a bass that's covering it. It sounds cool on its own, but in the context of a mix, it might be a little too much, especially on my system. I know I don't have enough subs to reproduce that much low end between this, the kick drum, and the bass. It's just too much. Now, I may grab a shelf and just brighten it up just a touch, just so I know it can poke out my mix. Now, in terms of compression, the only thing I'm really going to do with this is just more of a utility thing in that I want to have something that's going to help tame the dynamics of it in terms of when the synth is playing in its low mode, which is usually at the beginning of a song, the verse. It's usually a very dark sounding pad, and the volume output's usually pretty low because all the energy is covered up by a filter. Because usually what these keyboardists are doing is they're taking a low pass filter, rolling it all the way down so you're only hearing kind of the low kind of sound. And then what they'll do is when it gets to like the chorus, they'll roll that filter up and it like takes the top off of it and lets it all that energy out, all the fizziness out, and all of that volume comes up. So this is going to kind of act as like my first, it'll act like a finger on the fader at all times, but just like a first level of it. I'm still going to be able to adjust things, but it's there just to kind of do it automatically for me in a way that it's going to be more mindlessness, if you will. So let's listen to what we're doing here. And all I'm going to do is engage it. And right now we're cutting about 5 dB, which is not a ton in this case because we could easily just smash it, but we're not. And you can see we've got the attack set pretty slow. The release is kind of medium. We've got the ratio set to infinity because we want it to hard limit. We're saying nothing louder than this, but we are on a soft knee setting, so it gradually hits that point. And then as you can see, I've actually got the key for this sidechain to itself, but it's listening to that 1.14 kilohertz and above. It's listening to the brightness side of things, so that way when he does darken his pad, it'll actually release more. It won't actually work on the compressor as hard. It's focusing on the high-end energy of it, so that way when it hits those points, it's pulling it down to the level I want it. So if we were to go to a section where it was a little bit quieter, it's going to be about the same volume because it's keeping it there in line. All right, so those sound great, but how do they sound in context of everything else? Well, let's bring our keys in, bring those pads in. Not too bad, I'd say. I think that's pretty good. All right, so let's move on to the next video where we're going to talk about vocals, and then we're going to kind of go through everything else as a whole to get things wrapped up in this section.